Okay, so here's the linear rail installation for the Chiron. So I've got these printed drilling guides. This was to move the Z towers back 30 millimeters from their original position so that you can utilize the 400 millimeter travel on the y-axis. That's because the placement of the linear rails on the x-axis and just the shape of the stealth burner itself moves it forward 30 millimeters. I've already got my T-nuts and 3 millimeter by 8 screws all spaced into the linear rails. I've got the carriages greased and ready to go. I've actually already installed the end stops to prevent the carriages from falling off where they need to go. And these are the post-install T-nuts. So all they have to do is kind of spin into position. Although getting them exactly where they need to be. Oh, maybe I've got these backwards. I've actually got some printed assist guides that'll kind of help keep them centered. Now, I didn't want to do every single hole. I don't think it's necessary. And then these are so long, I'm actually skipping every other. And for this build, we actually want to put them on the inner of the 2040 rails. And if the question about where do you position the ends, I actually had pre-mounted these already, and when the bed itself is mounted, I actually have it so that it'll trigger the end stop switch, and then I move these a tiny bit back. So now to mount the bed, which I've already drilled the holes, and I made another helpful guide for drilling, which I will put both of these guides up on printables, and I'll link it in the description. And these screws are M3 by 8mm length. You're actually going to want to kind of start them, but don't tighten them all down until all of them are in place. That way you can make sure all of them are going to thread in that smoothly. Drilling these by hand was a little bit of a chore because I had to oversize the holes just slightly, because the tolerances on the linear rails are a lot tighter than I can do by hand. The screws on the bed joiner, I guess whatever you'd call it, one side is slotted, and I left that loose so that we'll be able to get it pretty accurately spaced before tightening everything up. Oops! I didn't make sure that the carriage was in the right spot. So yeah, make sure you have the carriages under the platform before putting your bolts in. Okay, they're on there. They are still loose. I want to make sure that you can actually slide it smoothly. And I kind of just snug these up one side at a time. I don't have the nice tools in all my sizes yet, so I'm going to have to use the included L wrenches for these. The bolts used here are actually 15mm M5s, button head, and the spacers under here are the 8mm ones that were removed from one of the original Chiron V-slot roller wheels. So you'll use these bolts and these spacers, and that'll actually give you the correct spacing needed to hit the switch. Check one more time. Oh yeah, it's a little tighter. Does not want to slide smoothly. Time to reinstall the Y-axis belt. Just going to loop it through there. These bolts just a little loose to hold it in place. Make sure we don't make a Mobius strip or anything. I never changed where the pinch location was on the when I took it off, so realistically it should be in the right spot. Tensioner. Probably good. Guess we'll find out when we start printing. I'll adjust it later. Don't want to tighten them up quite yet. I need to make sure everything's aligned first. Slide these, which we removed from the outside originally, we're going to flip them to the inside. I believe that's to clear the new X and Z motor mounts. And these also have the drop-in T-nuts. So once you line them up, they should just slide in and then you rotate. The appropriate Allen key, which is not that one. Just on the other side. Tightening these down before tightening down the lower ones should keep it flush. Maybe not square, but flush at least. Of course, we're going to recheck with an actual square once these are tight. I've got to double them up because I was only able to order 0.5 millimeter shims, and instructions call for 1 millimeter shims, but I also have a 1 millimeter nylon shim. I was actually going to try that out between the two bearings, and these are the flanged idlers. You can see the stack here. 0.5. 1 and then 0.5, which will actually end up being the 2 millimeters recommended spacing. Also, one thing to note, the bolt the instructions call for is a M5 by 40. That won't work with the Chiron's modified files because this block is actually, I believe, 5 millimeters thicker because of the 20 by 40 extrusion rather than the 30 millimeter extrusion. So the 20, of course, to bring it to the right depth. And this should just go in like that. Make sure they spin. Put our T-slot nut on here. It's ready to install. And repeat for the other side. Make sure you've got the flanges to where, you know, gotta have a little slot where the belt's gonna ride. And these have little notches in them, so you can align them properly. And when it's mounted on the Z-tower frame, it notes in the instructions, make sure that the little notch out where the belts go is facing down. Preload those. Oh, and I had to use a slightly longer bolt for here too. I think it calls for a 10 millimeter, but you end up using a 15 or a 16. Square it up with the edge there. Make sure it's flush. And if you're wondering, I actually put these two washers on this side because I had to use a 45 millimeter screw. However, the depth of my 2020 rail, it would end up bottoming out with the T-nut against the frame itself before actually pinching the plastic down. So you might have to shim yours or cut the bolt. Alright, these are the XZ blocks. They're a mirrored pair, but one of them, which will end up being face out, actually has like this little indent in it. One end is threaded, so you'll know which one to slide the bolts through, which actually are the loose ones have the indent. These also need one shim and a bearing set each. Now, of course, you're threading into plastic, so be very gentle with the tightness. It just needs to hold together. When you screw it down onto the extrusion, it'll end up basically pinching it together anyways. So, I'm going to repeat this for 2. Now, preparing the X rail, or the X axis assembly, you actually need to shorten both your linear rail and the original Chiron 2020 extrusion. This one will be cut down to about 510 millimeters. This one about 467. I know, it's an odd size, but that's what the instructions tell me. I used a grinder with a cutoff wheel for this one. Obviously, be careful. It's actually pretty heavy-duty stainless, so standard PPE is really recommended. This one I was able to just use my portaband. It's aluminum, cuts like butter. So now we've got that. We're gonna prepare the T-nuts, mount the rail, center it. We'll put the linear carriage on there, and then the little XZ pulleys will go on the ends. Using M3x8s, they're 3mm T-nuts. Might be easiest to lay it on its side. Prepare all of them. So you can do whatever works best for you. And yes, I am skipping every other hole. The Voron documentation even shows this as normal. I don't see why you would need to have every space filled. I mean, if you're short on parts, you can, I would assume you could probably even get away with one at the end and one in the middle. Or, you know, one on each end anyway. Voron STLs, you can find the little helpers that keep them aligned. That way it'll snugly be centered. You can even put your end pieces on to make sure that it's centered side to side. There'll actually be a tiny bit of a gap. I don't believe it's going to use the entire space, just because there is a little plastic deal at the end of the rail anyways, the carriage. Time to install the pulleys on the ends. Installing the X-axis pulleys at the ends of the rail. I'm using 5mm by 10 with your little T-nut. This might be a little difficult because you got to get it inside there. Start it. One on each side. And then don't forget the little notched flat piece is the one that will face the same direction as the rail. Slide them in from the end. Should actually be flush. And so you got to watch out. My T-nut did not spin. Sometimes I like to give these a little quick spin to try to... Oh man, it's being a booger. There we go. As you can see that, how they work inside. They end up rotating as you spin, and they'll spin into place, kind of locking into position. And need to double check all of them as you're going. Make sure they actually lock into place. That one did not. And before we put the other side on, don't forget to put the rail carriage on there. Butt that up against there. Might need some oil. Gonna have to go get some oil for that. Got it prepared. There we go. Time to attach it. And now we're going to mount the X-axis onto the Z carriages. Here's our preloaded, they call it the Z bearing block. Got the heat sets in there. I actually preloaded the T-nuts and the, I think they're 40mm M5s. Anyways, they're going to go on here. And then the other one, which has the cable chain mounting heat sets in there already. That'll go on the other side. So. Now we'll mount the entire X-axis assembly to these T-nuts. I've got them already lined up, so it should go on there. And of course it has a little bit of play, so we'll have to center it before we tighten it up. Of course we have to move it up and down a little bit too to make sure we're not binding. top. And it says in the instructions actually to move it all the way against the stops on the top so that it ends up being square to at least the top rail. Also because your linear rails, when you're mounted on the Z towers, they are pushed all the way up against the top end stops. The little plastic printed pieces like this one down here, which actually I think that one gets removed for another piece later. Got the X carriage. I already got the heat certs inserted on the parts that need it. These are the belt clamps. Just gonna preset them. Gotta leave them loose so you can slide the belt in there. And instead of heat certs, we're actually going to use some M3 nuts. The bed leveling probe I'm going to use is the Voron probe. Well, it's actually a cheap knockoff, but hopefully it'll work. The Vorons themselves are a little more pricey. It'll actually sit right inside there, and it's adjustable as far as your depth so that you know get it the right distance away from the bed after your nozzle and everything else are where they need to be. This, of course, only works if you have a steel sheet heat bed, which I bought the Hick Top knockoff brand, PEI textured sheet. Hopefully it'll work. It came with one of those peel and stick magnets. So, there's that. Got this brace prepared. Now we mount this part. Some M3x12. Might be tricky getting it to line up. Sometimes if we don't have a jig for the heat certs, they don't quite go in straight, or could also be getting a little bit of melted plastic into those threads, since I'm just using a soldering iron to press them in. Fortunately, they are brass, and even if they are slightly tight on the threads, it won't gall up like stainless to stainless will. Plus, it's in a printed part. If you end up ruining it, well, just print another one and use some new inserts. A little bit of snugness, not too tight. Adjustable. There. Now, one of the more challenging parts, as far as frustration levels go, is running the belts. Now, I've never done this before, so let's see how difficult it is. I've already got them pinched where they need to be on this side. I put my rail mounting little helpers as a parking brake. I don't pull too hard. Unfortunately, open end here I was going to loop that one down around the stepper. I think I'll try one belt at a time. I'm going to do the belt that's closer. Run it out and then go through the upper idler. Sorry, it's out of frame. In my living room, so I don't really want to get all the background in here as well. So since that one went around to the stepper motor first, it skips the stepper motor on this side, goes directly back to the X carriage. It looks like I will have plenty of belts. Basically bought a 5 meter GT2 belt and we'll cut it in half. That gives us a little extra to work with. And I'm not sure if there's some sort of trick to getting it into the little pinchers. Maybe using needle nose pliers or some tweezers. But I just loosened up the little tensioner just barely until it falls out. Make sure it's also not flipping around, rotating funny, and staying in its track. In, but can't tighten the tensioner yet, or the pincher rather. Got to run the other belt because they both get pinched. And this is the rear belt, which will skip the stepper on this side. It'll loop up and over and grab the stepper on the other side. Try not to tie it in a knot, and make sure it stays on its bearing path. Now we can kind of put a little tension on. Tighten bolts. That pinches them in place. There we have it. Now I'll have to trim the extra and do the proper tensioning.